you're still here. Oh my goodness. Hey, Jody, what time is it for you? Erica.
It
I don't know.
is
Leaving,
8 p.m.
coming, 8 p.m. Oh, that's not too bad.
It's fine.
It's not too bad.
Oh, 8 p.m. is great. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's not bad. Because usually with North America, it's some crazy time. I'm always trying to talk to Esther and it's morning for me. And
Oh, I'm on the West Coast and I'm much closer than
so it's
Esther.
much
This
better.
whole 3 hours makes all the difference.
Oh gosh, yeah, hers is completely crazy. All right. It is 12. Hi, Erica. Oh my goodness, I love the color.
Yeah, but the only problem with it is I'm really easy to find in an airport and stuff like that. But I had a skin cancer removed. I don't know if you can see the scar there, and I reckon the bright pink makes the scar look a bit more fluorescent.
Not at all.
No, don't see a thing.
But I love the fact that you're concerned about being found in an airport. I didn't know there were places which had airports which you needed to be found in. We're still in some sort of weird.
I know,
limbo.
God.
Well, at the moment, there's no one in them. They're empty. I was just chatting to a colleague who came back from Canada, and she said 2 flights landed at the one time. Like in Sydney Airport, it's, you know, usually mental.
Madness, yeah.
Yep, there's no one around.
Okay. Oh my God, do we have a tiny little group of people, which is great because I've been at 4 hours of class and I haven't even had lunch, going straight through. It was, I just tell my students, okay, all right, that's enough. Okay, all right, let's go. Okay, bye. Hang up on them. So that I could make it to the technical check.
What, you just swirled on your chair once and this is it. You are now at LCT 3.5. Same place.
My hair, put some makeup. Oh my goodness, it's completely crazy. This is a time period, yes, I understand, when fewer people are awake. Small group chat. Don't worry, Carl, I'm delighted by the small group chat. I'm fine with it. The less people to watch me struggle through. All right, shall I get started? I was going to be so formal. I had slides which said things like, this is LCT Singapore. But instead of doing that, all right. I'm just going to quickly say that, okay, so LCT Singapore and LCT Japan are combining together today. So me and Laetitia representing LCT Singapore, and we have Daniel who's just joined us from Melbourne as well. So LCT Singapore is going from being very small, but hopefully very impactful to, you know, one a whole extra person. So we're very excited. And Thomas has been joining us from Japan. So we're even more excited. We can become LCT South and East and something Asia, LCT Asia, which is fantastic. Okay. So just very quickly, we're going to be working through 3 different presentations, all looking at how we can use LCT for researching what happens in our classrooms and how that informs our practice as well to a certain extent. I'm going to be looking at a nursing project, a slightly different version of this, which I did in Roundtable, but I'm going to be bringing slightly different data. And then English for academic purposes, focusing on a CLIL subject. So Laetitia is going to be looking at a chapter that she's doing on critical reflection for one of our books. And then Thomas is going to be looking at teaching in multilingual classrooms. I thought we'd just start with like a little informal chat. Laetitia, when did you first hear about LCT? And why did you start using it?
Okay, I first heard about LCT when I started my doctorate looking into transfer with SFL, but then there was that paper called a Tall Order on the Journal of Academic Language and Literacy. And that kind of gave me a broader way to look at knowledge and curriculum, not just what I was going to do with the knowledge about language in curriculum. So it was very exciting and it was perfect for what I needed at that time.
Okay, Thomas, what about you?
Excuse me. Well, similar to Laetitia, I found it during my PhD. Wasn't so much a specific paper, it was more just sort of in the water at the time. Like I was on the SFunk email lists, and this came up in discussion with my supervisor, John Knox of Macquarie. And it was like I had already decided to do a move towards multimodality. I'm like, this looks really cool, and I just cannot add it to this project. But I always sort of promised myself, I'm going to work with this as soon as I can. And that's what I've been doing.
Yeah. Okay. Me? All right. So I was in Carl's masterclasses in Sydney when I was doing my PhD. So that was, just one of those moments where you were seated there and he was drawing the Cartesian plane and doing some crazy things with that on the board. And I was just kind of like, oh my God, what's going on here? And it was just incredible. I think what I loved about it was that he looked at knowers and knowledge. And for me, that was so much fun because I suddenly thought to myself, finally, somebody is not talking about knowledge as just being about science and tech and engineering. They're saying that there's some amazing and incredibly complex way in which knowledge is building in humanities, and trying to explain what that is, which I thought was so fantastic. And I loved it because I felt like a lot of my teaching was very much for students who were in sort of science, STEM subjects and things like that. So I was like really happy to hear, instead of thinking of this as a dichotomy, thinking of this as, two sides to the same piece of paper. Oh my God, no, that's so surreal. Sorry. I was just telling my students about the piece of paper, but yeah. So I just found it really exciting and interesting. And then, I think knowledge and knowers hadn't come out. So Carl was talking about many of those concepts then. So it was a really exciting time to hear about it. So I think I'm just going to get started. Everyone's gonna have to be really nice to me and like jump in, make comments. Because to keep my energy going, when my voice starts to fade, Laetitia will bravely have to step in and take over like I did for her on Tuesday, where I had a few moments where I was like, I know this slide. I do know this slide.
Thank you, Nam. That you made it sound really, really good. I will check the recording.
And you will be like, wrong. No, that's not what I meant.
Go ahead, Nam.
All right, so I'm just going to be looking at a nursing project that LCT Singapore has been working on for a few years. It started off really well, and then COVID hit, and then the nursing faculty was just basically in chaos for like 1.5 years because they basically couldn't do any clinical placements. They had a really tough time because there were students who were finishing their degrees who had to sort of go into wards in the middle of a massive pandemic just when they didn't know what was happening. And there were procedures they couldn't perform, and so the poor faculty was just really struggling to get the students through because the practical component is huge for nursing, obviously, right? That's so much of what they do on the ground. So it kind of put a pause to our project, but then we sort of reignited it a little bit later. And so I'm just going to be looking at some of the things that we learned and how we used LCT to sort of push the boundaries a little bit in terms of where we found in the data that bringing in axiological clusters and constellations helped us understand the way in which these nursing students were kind of made into nursing professionals over time through their clinical practice. Because I think clinical practice is one of those instances where critical reflection is incredibly important and really a fantastic teaching tool, because the students have to face so many difficult incidents when they walk into the clinic. It's really actually quite hard, isn't it, Laetitia, to read these critical reflections where the students are talking about sort of like dressing wounds, and it's just really, really sort of confronting, I think, even to read them. And we're like sitting in the safety of our offices and reading them. And you're thinking some of these kids are 18, 19 years old, and they are bathing and cleaning people and dealing with these really confronting physical, bodily issues, which then they have to engage with and be really professional about. So it's quite challenging. So that was our project, basically, with the Alice Lee Center for Nursing Studies. So the nurses were wonderful. They watched us give a presentation on critical reflection. They approached us. They said, we really like the idea of using your particular frameworks, etc. Will you come and do a little teaching intervention? And then we applied for a grant for a 2 to 3 year project. And the grant was basically about creating a teaching intervention to make critical reflection better, to teach it back to the students so that they produce higher quality reflections, because the nursing lecturers were saying, look, it's really important for us to know how they manage the emotions, manage the knowledge, manage the skills that constitute nursing practice. And we created a rubric using SFL and LCT, but I'm going to focus today on an LCT component of it in terms of looking at evaluative language. So the 3 phases, I kind of talked you through that. We're now in the post-intervention phase. So we're looking at, after our teaching interventions, what kinds of assignments did we get back? Like I said, it was a little bit delayed. So we're kind of looking at a whole new data set right now. We don't have results from it yet. We're still working with our initial round of assignments, which were based on, we had absolutely no input in the classroom. It was basically critical reflection assignments that the nursing staff taught, and then they gave us and said, these are good examples, these are slightly poorer, weaker examples. Can you tell us how to push the weaker students towards producing better reflections? So our question really was about what constitutes deep reflection in clinical nursing practice. And this concept of deep reflection, highly valued in higher education. But of course, for all of you who are working in the discipline, you are well aware of the fact that it's not something that is well theorized, made explicit in any way. Everyone is a bit confused. Reflection, well, okay, deep reflection, not really sure what that means. So we tried to work with nursing staff and the nursing lecturers to really ask them, okay, how do we make deep reflection visible? And of course, we constantly consulted with them, because we wanted to know, are we working with the parameters and the understandings of what deep reflection constitutes within your discipline? Because for us, the concepts that you're working with are not something we're familiar with. So what were the students expected to do in this critical reflection task? They were actually asked to choose a difficult or challenging situation to focus on in relation to daily assisted activities that they had to perform. So things like bathing elderly patients, dressing their wounds, taking their pulse, etc., and just basically checking up on them, making sure they took their medication. So there were a number of activities that they needed to perform, and this was their first clinical placement. So they had to step back from their first round of clinical placements, doing the things that they'd learned about in class and thinking about how they performed. And engage with that in terms of nursing knowledge. So the theoretical framework that the nurses were using, a really popular one in the field, many of you worked in critical reflection, I'm sure, are familiar with the Gibbs reflective cycle. These kinds of process-oriented cycles are very popular in critical reflection research. This idea of moving through description, what happened, what were you thinking and feeling, what was good and bad about the experience, and what sense can you make of the situation. Of course, the analysis component is incredibly complex, right? But there's no bridging across from share your feelings, now analyze your feelings, make them the object of analysis. There's no bridging of that in terms of the teaching that was being done. There definitely isn't time. And of course, the knowledge or the expertise on how to do that, which is why they wanted us to step in. So our first phase was analyzing the assignments that the nursing staff gave us, and then using legitimation code theory and systemic functional linguistics. So we looked at things like genre, because they were talking about structure and staging. The students weren't going through all the different steps in Gibbs cycle. That was a problem for them. And then they mentioned things like, students are being too emotional, or they're describing and then not bringing any emotions in. So that was the kind of thing that we were looking at in relation to evaluative meaning. And then semantic waves, we used semantic gravity, which was what Mark worked on, which was basically looking at how the students engage with more sort of abstract and concrete meanings in the discipline. And from that, we sort of came up with annotated texts to try and talk students through, show students examples of what other students had done. and to talk them through what was considered good and bad about the different ways in which other students tried to enact critical reflection and use evaluative resources, etc. So I'm just looking at evaluation. So initially, when we were working, we had a toolkit that we built, and we looked at both strong and weak samples. And in the weak samples, we were talking students through things that were valued as well as things that were not. So we talked about, for instance, how the students use emotion. And one of the things that we drew attention to was the fact that students should avoid doing things like talking about the emotions of the patient. So for instance, saying that the patient was withdrawn or sad or unhappy or frustrated, because the nursing staff said, well, you don't really know what the patient is feeling at that moment unless you ask them. It's not okay for you to project your own emotions onto them, certainly not for you to judge them based on your own emotions and your interactions with them. And then also students would do things like they would talk about other nursing staff behavior. So let me just show you an example of how we looked at these patterns of meanings in the text and tried to see, okay, in the description phase, and then when the students were sharing their feelings of the good and bad experiences, what patterns of evaluative meaning could we see? So the first kind of sections of clusters that we could see emerging, couplings of ideational and interpersonal meaning, or how the evaluations and the person or thing being evaluated was being determined in these student texts, was something that we saw as being, we saw like predominant patterns emerging. So, you know, low scoring students had certain patterns that emerged in the text which were not considered valued by the nursing lecturers and clearly showed in their use of language. So for instance, this student, there's a student who talks about the patient in terms of what the patient can't do. They could only speak Hokkien. They wouldn't reply to me when I spoke to them. So there's a lot of invoked negative judgment there. They also had emotions of the patient. The patient was withdrawn, was abused, kept evaluating the patient and the significance of the patient in the context of that clinical placement. And this was not okay with the nursing staff. They said, okay, we're not okay with her calling this person an abused patient and then making all these assumptions about what that means. That's not, at her level of understanding, that's not acceptable. So, you know, she talks about things like the patient was complaining, all right? Again, something they were told, no, as professionals, you can't bring in things about what the patients are feeling. So there was a lot of judgment of the patients. There was also judgment of other nurses. So I observed that none of the nurses talked to her. So the student talks about none of the nurses were talking to her, paying attention to her, giving her the kind of care that's expected in the profession. So this was considered, these two examples of negatively judging the patient as a cluster and negatively judging other nurses as a cluster was not highly valued by the nursing disciplinary lecturers, because they said it's not appropriate at this stage for them to be judging other nurses yet, unless it's something that falls into their you know, the clinical curriculum. They need to focus primarily on their own actions, think about the own role that they played in this particular instance. It's okay for them to positively judge themselves, but they also need to, you know, focus on what they could have done better. So most of the critical reflection will sort of talk about, you know, what did the students do well? And this is what the only thing that the student tries to focus on, right? So she talks about all the things that she did well. And the nursing lecturers said, well, you know, that is good, but typically in their experiences in clinical placements, they mostly do things wrong in their first placement. So, you know, it's more valuable for them to think at this moment in time about, you know, what are some of the things I did well and what are some of the things I didn't do so well. So the student who did well had interesting things going on in their text. They were talking about all of the things that they were feeling. They were eager, they were anxious, they were concerned. Then they talk about the things that they couldn't do, right? I could only assist the patient. I couldn't walk freely around the cubicle. So they're talking about the limitations based on the environment that they're in when they're trying to help the patient in some way. And then they talk about the clinical instructor in a positive way. The clinical instructors are not their disciplinary lecturers. They're clinical instructors who are placement nurses in the field, who are very experienced and are taking the students through these lessons. So some of the sort of valued clusters that emerge, sharing the negative emotions because the students feel a lot of them, maybe sharing the negative judgments of themselves as a student nurse, positive judgments of their clinical instructors, but also talking about what they learned and what they did well. So for instance, this particular student ends up saying, the clinical nurse helped me, was very patient, and as a result, I was able to be more organized and focused. So they don't mind if you focus on the positive and the negative things, but this is considered a good example because it goes through the range of expected emotions that they want the students to be able to reflect on. So insights using axiological clusters allowed us to think about what constitutes deep reflection and try to make that visible to students. But an additional question was, how then do you move from that to analysis and sense making? So I'm going to go through this quickly because I don't want to take time away from the other speakers, but I'm just going to show you that when they're making sense of the situation, that they are expected to go into more abstract meaning and engage with professional standards in the field of nursing. So there is, for instance, epistemic social and social relations in nursing that are identified, the empirics, the aesthetics. There's a sense that the art of nursing is different from the knowledge in nursing. So there's a differentiation made there about subjective knowledge and social relations versus the more sort of objective theoretical knowledge and how that's realized in their curriculum. And that actually filters down into these big policy documents like core competencies in nursing that are created by the Singapore Nursing Board. And what they do is they talk about these really abstract concepts, qualities, attributes, and skills. They define concepts such as competency, and they basically outline things like in management of care, you need to do the following things: demonstrate effective communication, ensure consistent and continuous holistic quality of care, maintain safe environments, apply strategies to promote health and prevent illness. And students are somehow supposed to link the events that are happening in clinical practice with these kinds of core competencies and demonstrate their capacity to show how these kinds of more abstract concepts are realized in clinical placement. And they do this quite effectively. So for instance, with management of care, we have a student talking about bringing in the literature in terms of knowledge. So first of all, they talk about, okay, these are the things that this is what happened. My patient was a fall risk. And then they go to the fall risk literature. So why is a fall risk a problem? And then they bring in nursing knowledge. And bringing in that nursing knowledge is part of their ability to provide appropriate care in the context of nursing. So they talk about the fact that they learned when they went to the literature that for elderly patients, fall risks mean severe complications, suffering from head injuries, confined to a wheelchair, and then 1 in 4 patients can completely lose their independence. So they show that they're going to the literature to understand why they need to manage the care in a way that ensures that the patient is not at risk. And they do this by going to outside to nursing knowledge and then bringing that nursing knowledge into the specific instance of practice and bringing the two things together. So what they're essentially doing is building a constellation of meanings, and those constellations start to have align with particular larger cosmologies of nursing practices, nursing knowledge, all of these beliefs that they're taught, and that then they find in the situations of practice, they take that individual instantiation of what happened, and then they align with certain respected constellations, such as standards of care that are, or core competencies that are outlined by the nursing board. So this is what the larger constellation of nursing competency looks like. Typically in the critical incident, student will talk about the nurse in-person narrative, and then they will move to the general every nurse narrative. And as they move to the general every nurse narrative, what you have is the student trying to align with values, so skills, attitudes, and knowledge that's considered accepted of nurses in general. So they try to show how during the critical incident, they didn't have one of these particular competencies, but they acquired these competencies over time, and that these competencies are something they will apply when they are in a similar clinical situation. So that's what they are trying to do over the course of the critical reflection, and that's what we try to make visible. So LCT really helped us, I think, to show them the patterns of meaning as axiological clusters, but also to talk about how that meaning is part of their nursing professional competencies, and as they develop as nurses, that meaning has to be aligned with the bigger constellations of what constitutes appropriate nursing competencies in the context in which they're practicing. That's all from me. So I'm just going to pass on to who was next. Was it Laetitia or Thomas? Do you want to go? No, Laetitia, you have a class coming up, right? Go ahead. All right. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, we can ask questions at the end. I rushed through that so that or you can ask questions now, whatever you like. No, I didn't think about, I know we do have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So please.
Yeah, at the end, it's up to you. Okay, all right. So thank you, Nam. It was lovely to work with these nurses. We had a lot of fun. And LCT was really useful to bring something to the table that is intriguing for them as well. Yeah. So it was it was lovely. I was just saying I've been following most of the conference on YouTube. It's just a very nice way to do that. As I was rushing around campus into classes and stuff, I watched Erica yesterday on big dichotomies, part of it, and then managed to see the plenary as well. Okay, so today I'm just talking about critical thinking in my module and a few problems I've had with this. So I'm going to take you along from that problem in the classroom, which was my students' understanding of critical thinking and how I was expecting them to engage with the readings, and some of them weren't doing that and probably are still not doing it because it's a bigger problem, which is my point today. And basically my attempt to answer these questions, what has led my students to write the stuff they're writing. And so I'm shifting kind of from that very specific problem to broader kind of context. I won't look at dispositions. I won't look at epistemic orientations because it's too much, but obviously that counts a lot as well. And I'll just look at student broader educational context and the socio-cultural environment. And so what Carl was saying during the plenary was really echoed. He said cosmologies are hiding in plain sight. And in fact, it's what I was kind of getting at. The cosmologies are hiding in our students' texts. So the context is, this is a writing module for undergrads. There's a level 1, level 2. And it's clear, so it's content-based, so we each kind of have a topic. Our students come from a range of disciplines, so it's mixed groups. And for this specific module, it's color semiotics, so we cover these kind of things. We look at color meaning in the social world, how it construes a range of phenomenon, and then practice in things like films, marketing, design, or even the students' disciplines. And we take a social semiotic approach. And level 2 is research, so it's guided research into color semiotics. So the precise problem occurred with how students engaged with knowledge in the level 1 when they were asked to write a reflective summary response. So that requires them to summarize a core reading and engage with one of its themes into a sort of response. It's an assessment structure that's common to all of the modules on the program. So I would have changed it if I could have, but I couldn't. And so I found myself saying very often, critical thinking is not the ability to criticize, and then it's not desperately finding ways to disagree. And so after repeating this over 2 semesters or so, I just thought, okay, I'm not getting to them. So I thought, what is it that they're doing that is just not what I expect them to do? So what characterizes that type of engagement that I don't value, that is not valued in this module? So I looked at how they engage with the task in high and low achievement bands, so I could compare. So that then I would try to then answer the next question, which is, what does this tell us about their understanding of what valued critical thinking in this module is. So the data was drawn from a response, the students' response to this paper, which briefly just dismisses the notion that color preference is a biological phenomenon. So little girls are not biologically inclined to like pink. So this basically dismisses the biological notion. And so I use cosmologies to do this, axiological cosmologies. There's a couple of definitions here that show why it's quite useful, because those underpin actors' viewpoints. Actors also align their stances to these broader discourses more or less consciously and to different degrees. So my idea was to ask, what is the cosmology that a student is aligning to then when they are engaging in a specific way with the task. I use clusters of axiological meanings then, so an evaluative meaning attached to an ideational meaning, followed Esther and Namali and Esther on this. So here you have an example. Their study is the target, is limited, a negative evaluation on this. So before I show you what the problematic students were doing, problematic texts maybe, these are the high achieving ones. So there were many of those as well, of course, but just a significant number of those problematic ones to make me want to know a bit more. So the non-problematic texts engage with the field of study. So their target of evaluation is the field of study, following Susan Hood there. So in this case, color semiotics, gender identification and color preference, so all of that content. They engage with the article's findings, the positions, the claims, and so on. And there tends to be minimal resources in terms of judgment, and quite a lot of engagement resources. In this case, that align, but that is not necessarily the issue. They could disalign with the field of study, and that would be equally valued. For this particular text, they were aligning. So you have an example of what I mean by what I expect students to do. So for example, showing me that they're going to find additional sources to support a finding in the original text, bringing in those readings and saying how they complement, support, extend, etc. Right? So, but the focus here is the field of study. Now, very drastically differently, the low achieving students engage sometimes solely with the field of research. So in that case, they are looking at the methodology of that core paper. So the targets are completely different. We have things like experiments, methods, findings. Here, for example, this first cluster is the authors. So you can see them referred in different ways. The field of research in terms of methods. So we've got the experimental factor stages, experiments, and so on. And the results as well. But in this case, not the results, the specific results, but just the results in terms of like a general term. The student here qualifies, evaluates the findings as an abstract term, doesn't go into details. And so we get things like the research is limited, cannot be generalized, the methods are not conclusive. And sometimes students can write, the particularly weak ones can write a whole response that doesn't once mention the field of study and that stays at the field of research. So over a whole assignment, students then build those types of negatively charged constellations around the core reading, with the authors evaluated as incompetent, the methods are ill-designed, the results are skewed or invalid. And so here it gives me a kind of an insight into how students engage with the knowledge. They seem to be engaging with the knowledge as evaluating the knowledge validity, but this knowledge validity is equated to methodology accuracy, and the criteria of evaluation seems to be very quantitative or positivist, and we see it in all the terms used, the bias, the sampling, and so on. So I wondered why they are doing this, and why they are doing this, although I tell them, you know, this is not, you shouldn't try desperately to find faults and etc. But obviously I wasn't actually addressing the real problem, I think. So that's another quote from Carl, that all practices reflect a cosmology. There's also this idea that social structure is present in all interactions. So this difference in axiological meanings that are built in those students' assignments then reflects broader cosmologies, social cultural understandings, etc. So what are they? For critical thinking, I think we need to go further than just the discipline, because it is something that is actually very present in the whole educational discourse in Singapore. So this is just first like a few main conceptualization of critical thinking. So associated with evaluation, construction of arguments, also associated with tradition of empiricism, scientific method as legitimate knowledge building. Critical thinking is also seen as a skill, can be seen as a skill. So here's the ability to evaluate source credibility and to solve problems flexibly, and so to fit in the needs of the modern flexible workforce. And then, of course, critical thinking is also emancipatory, or can be conceptualized like this. So in this case, it's about unearthing structural and systemic assumptions. So what is it then that the students are exposed to in Singapore that would maybe lead many of them to recurrently kind of engage with knowledge in my module like this? So in the general educational discourse, mainly through these two documents, the working paper on creative and critical thinking from NIE, which was a paper for the government policies, and then this is NUS also general core curriculum documents. These are the type of associations that we get with critical thinking. So a sort of human capital ideology in a changing world. So there's that exhortation almost, we must adapt, and critical thinking is an essential skill to adapt to globalization, neoliberalism, whatever it is. So you have it associated to ability to analyze, evaluate sources, reflect, associated to the country's capability to cope with changing society, healthy skepticism. It's a means to getting the right answer. It's associated with a focus on value-free objective knowledge, open mind, associated to cognitive processes like the ability to analyze, synthesize, and it has to be sensitive to context that is in the NUS documents that can be read in loads of different ways. So you can see that from the previous slide, there's nothing about emancipation here. It's very much the central one, the human resource, the human capital, and a bit of the first one as well. Now, this is how this understanding is translated in school curriculum. So Lionel Lim, who is at NIE here, has done a really amazing study on this. And so he went to mainstream schools and elite schools, and he had a look at how it was taught. So in mainstream schools, critical thinking is an instrumental skill to get to a right answer. In social sciences subject, it's more conflated with evaluating claim credibility. And in elite school, it's done slightly differently. It's part of the philosophy program. So in this case, it's about evaluating arguments, logical analysis, but around, again, scientific methodology and rational inquiry. In NUS, I mean, this is a bit additional kind of a thing. I've told you in NUS, it's about flexible thinking and in the right, what was written there? Sensitive to context, yeah, that was it. But to understand my students as well, I need to say that they have all taken a compulsory quantitative reasoning module at NUS in their first year. There is no qualitative reasoning equivalent either. All right, so all of these things are starting to kind of make sense to me as to why they end up engaging with knowledge in that way. So in the US context, Giroux talks about a culture of positivism. I haven't found this being said about Singapore, but I think there's probably quite enough evidence maybe to align with that. So Lim sees a contradiction in this, right? He says we're in a authoritarian society, and we have that massive push for critical thinking. It's everywhere in our educational documents. So on the one hand, we have those liberal aspirations and an illiberal regulatory discourse. And so we're trying to teach critical thinking as foremost analytical skills, etc. But at the same time, we're giving the means to emancipatory knowledge. But he concludes as well, I mean, he concludes that the way this is done in Singapore is that because the focus is so heavily on the readily visible, and we see it on the students, in these students' assignments, how they focused very much on the empirical domain. So there seems to be no connection then with the underlying phenomena, the structure, whatever it might shape the empirical. And so critical thinking with this very heavy focus on skills and on logical argumentation kind of puts aside what is not readily visible. And so those realms are made unrelated, disconnected. And so in a way, there's maybe little chance that critical thinking can be emancipatory if we can't reach higher into finding some causes. So this is it. So this is my so what end slide. So critical thinking then is a key goal, but it's recontextualized through a human capital and empiricist lens. So the students' texts then reveal this cosmology. I mean, that's what I think is one part of the explanation. And that's why if I just tell them critical thinking is not criticism, that's not going to work, because what is influencing their response to knowledge is connected to something much bigger than misunderstanding this particular assignment. And so when we ask our students to think critically, we really need to be aware as much as possible as what is shaping their understanding of criticality. And then, so in a way, I'm doing what I'm asking my students to do as well. And if underlying causes can't really be explored, solving problems becomes difficult. Like in a crazy fictional world, we would be attending workshops, for example, on free-floating well-being, and mental health, and the structural reasons for that would never be mentioned. That's kind of a joke. We've just been to many of those workshops. So what to do? I think I'll be discussing these various conceptualizations of critical thinking a lot more openly with students, just to unpack a little bit the ideological assumptions. And then I think I'll also teach constellations directly as well, just showing them this idea of what are the targets, how is that student engaging, and then explaining why this is not really what's required here. And I think that's it from me. Thomas, I'll stop sharing. I'll show you some of the,
Thanks, Laetitia. Thomas, do you want to go ahead, or do we want to take a little break and ask questions, or?
Well, Laetitia, you said you have to go in a moment, so maybe questions for Laetitia now would be a good idea.
Actually, that's a good point.
Hi from Wenzhou. I really like what you're doing there in Singapore. I did my PhD in this subject actually, and have always, asked the question of whether, what we can do in EAP, and I really like the way that you are approaching it, which is to, explore its different meanings. In my own findings, it has a disciplinary base. We can only touch very lightly on it in EAP, and I like very much the way that you are approaching it. I suppose the language of critical thinking at the moment in the EAP classroom is a lot to do with what it is not, rather than what it is, right? So, it's difficult from a pedagogy point of view because, how do you teach students what it is when your language is about what it is not? So it's very challenging. So I like the fact that you're doing that exploratory, this is one way, this is another way, this is another way, this is another way, and perhaps moving them towards what it is in the particular task that you're asking them to do.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And I agree, Ed,
I like
it's
that
also, it's very much, that's what I was saying at the beginning, it is also very much based on their disciplines, but because our students come from many different disciplines, I didn't actually, for this assignment, I didn't observe any disciplinary differences. So it's not that the engineers tend to respond one way and the social sciences respond another way. So that's why I thought, okay, I'm going to try to go a bit beyond. And critical thinking is such a visible term in educational discourse in Singapore. So much so that it's kind of, you can tell it's kind of curated in a certain way. So it is there. And it's also in a way, I mean, if I want to be a bit more critical, it's also in a way disarmed by the fact that it's just cut off the like a more multi-layered ontology type of thing. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The disciplinary, the students' own dispositions as well, all of this plays a part. Thank you.
Yes, and critical thinking is everything, as Erica said. It's just nobody has any idea what it means. It's really hard to pin down. Everyone has different definitions of it, and all of the sort of Faccioni type and frameworks the tool mean. So everyone's like, it means a car, and you're like, and it doesn't, it's really difficult for students, I think, to understand what it is. But like Laetitia said, to a certain extent in our context, that's convenient as well.
Namali, it's almost as if you need like a collection of research papers that were put into a book on critical reflection.
Oh, do we? Anyone doing that, Daniel, do you think? Come to our book launch, everyone, in the afternoon. So we're very excited about that, because this is exactly the problem that we started with. Me and Esther, when we were working on it, was just this frustration with having to teach critical thinking, but then everyone, and reflection, specifically while looking at critical reflection, but everyone just being so sort of vague about what it means. And then there's people who say critical reflection is all about the kinds of things that Laetitia is talking about, worldview shifts and dispositions and all of that kind of really murky area, which everybody kind of knows what it means, but nobody actually wants to get into it. So
and I've just more and more noticed how it's so much packaged as the idea that we must adapt. There's a book, I can't remember now, but that kind of uncritiqued kind of exhortation that we must adapt, and critical thinking is going to help us adapt to whatever, instead of saying, well, do we have to adapt actually, or should we just kind of again, find the real causes for the problems and address those, and maybe we don't need to adapt them. So it's just kind of into that. Yeah, I mean, in Singapore, it's definitely about that flexible, magical, and very intelligent workforce that is just going to continually adapt. That's it about my rant.
Billy, I think you raised your hand.
Sorry,
Billy.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Billy.
It's a bit early in the morning for me to be so. But yeah, I was just listening to you and remembering the days when I was EGAP and CLIL lecturer and sharing all your frustrations and thanking a bit of my luxury of being able to integrate literacy in the classroom, but still feeling this frustration with my colleagues who constantly, said, oh, we need to think about assessment. How can we get the students to write something substantive? Oh, get them to write a reflective piece, says my colleague. When I was a student, the reflective piece was like, the huge new thing, and we all did it. But, and now we're still doing what we were taught as students, and nobody's thinking about getting the students to write something solid and with some semantic density. Anyway, yeah. So,
and then everyone bemoans the fact that the students are writing things with such little depth in it. Why is it so simple? Why are they writing a Dear Diary moment about what happened to them today? And why is it so basic? And it's because you're just not setting them up for that kind of success, right? You're kind of asking them to jump in the deep end. I always tell them reflections are the kinds of things you do when you feel so comfortable with a field and you're, at a certain point in your career, you have people like Bourdieu writing crazy things where they're self-reflecting on things, and it's incredible and insightful and deep and meaningful. But for an undergraduate student, it's a really hard assignment, I think, if you don't give them specific parameters and show them what you expect and what you have set as a basis of achievement. Of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, right, Laetitia? This is a safe space where we're preaching to the choir. Yeah, it's not working. We're used to resistant audiences, I guess, like you said, with colleagues. Important part, that's such an important part. You need to be steeped in it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, exactly. Face palm moment of you're writing about yourself. It's like looking in a mirror and you are writing about your own experiences, which is subjective. So do whatever you want. And then no, bad. This is a bad assignment when you get your students' Dear Diaries back. All right, Thomas, Laetitia, I'm going to move on to Thomas so that we have time.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
It was so much fun. Thank you.
Before we do that,
sorry, Thomas, tell me.
No worries. I was going to actually ask, is Daniel, because you and Laetitia were working on similar work. Daniel, are you working in a similar field, or because maybe it would be better for y'all to be together, or me?
No, well, I'm not planned to talk at this particular point.
Okay, I had forgotten that.
The next session. Yeah, that's okay. He's doing the next session.
Okay, no worries. Then one moment. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that I was on board. Okay, one moment, please. Let me get my screen up. Okay, can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, 1 second. Now let me pull you guys up because I like to see the chat and practice my
I think I had a really embarrassing moment in when Lee was like, "Hey, hello everyone, tell us where you're from," and they put up an upside down world map, and I think I put Singapore in a completely different part of the world. Like I just clicked something, and then Lee was like, "And there's somebody here from Indonesia," and I'm like, "That must have been me." Because I couldn't find the little red dot in this map.
Okay, well, I missed that, so I guess maybe it will. Anyway, well, thank you everyone for coming, and completely different topic, although not so different since we're kind of in the EFL world, but we're looking at somewhat different situation, looking at how autonomy might be useful, looking at teaching in multilingual classrooms. Hi, I'm Thomas. I know most of you all here, but I'm associate professor at English education at Nara University of Education. And if we're lucky, we might have one of the deer walk by today, although I don't see anyone today, but we'll see. We just recently went back to remote lessons. So the deer, Nara Park is right next door, and the deer at Nara Park feel this campus is kind of their second home, and with not so many students on campus now, they might be coming around again. But we'll see. Sometimes you have entire herds running through, but not today. But probably when I'm like really in the middle of my talk or something, it'll happen. So just be on the lookout behind me. Anyway, so thank you very much for coming. Those of you who have seen me at roundtables already, you'll probably, some of this will seem old, but I'm going to be going into a different direction. In today's talk, I'll be first, of course, giving a background of the study, giving a little bit of background information about English education in Japan, plus talking about the data that I'm working with, give a little bit of an overview of what I've done so far, looking at pedagogy, multimodality, and semantic gravity, and then looking at 4 different segments in terms of autonomy, asking some questions, and then see what's next. So let's get started. I've been presenting this for about the past year or so, looking mainly at semantic gravity, though. And this is all really a work in progress. And I really do appreciate any comments, as well as your patience over this process. And I do appreciate your comments. And actually, I want to thank people who have attended to my talks previously, because it's been really helpful in helping me work through these ideas. And thank you very much, Billy. I saw you there. I reflected and used some of your reflection. There's that word again. Used some of your ideas actually in my talk today. But anyway, about foreign language education in Japan. It's part of the curriculum here, and it's basically synonymous with English education. And all schools, public and private, use the same what's called the course of study that's proposed by MEX, the Ministry of Education. The official English abbreviation is MEXT. And so you have about 98% of the students who complete high school have at least 8 years of English. And the changes, these happened in 2020. That's going to be from 10 years. So from now, you'll have people graduating with 10 years of English education under their belt. But Japan's level of English has been dropping in the last few years, and according to standardized tests. Here's the EF English Proficiency Index shows Japan at 55, whereas its nearest neighbors and economic competitors, South Korea and China, have been going up. So Japan is actually considered a low-level country, whereas China and South Korea are considered mid-level. And so it's within this context that present study is investigating. So people might wonder, well, what are the students learning in the classes? Now, they've officially been doing CLT, communicative language teaching classes, since the 80s. And in principle, the high school English classes are to be taught in English. That's been the rule since 2011. And from 2020, junior high school classes were supposed to be taught in principle in English as well. But in practice, what tends to happen is what's called Juken Eigo, or examination English. And I have a pull quote from an article from 2004 that illustrates this, that basically the studying in these classes is just studying grammar and vocabulary and reading comprehension. And it's especially within the context of translation exercises, doing what's called yakudoku, which is literally, the kanji is, translate and read. And it's characterized by extensive IRF sequences of translating individual words and sentences from textbook passages and in written translation exercises. Now, a lot of talk about Japanese EFL, English education, will call this grammar translation. And that's not really accurate, because grammar translation, you choose like a grammar point and then you study it and you try to translate based upon that, based towards that. In Yakudoku, the goal is more on creating a syntactically correct Japanese translation, and that's the basis for your understanding. The thing is, though, this isn't actually in the official MEXT curriculum. Okay, so you've got what Hashimoto and Glasgow in a recent book chapter call sort of a difference, where there's a de jure language policy of continued of English only, but the Juken Eigo and Yakudo are kind of a de facto policy. So you've got this tension here, and that tension is affecting the choice of target for examining autonomy codes, and I'll be going into that in today's talk. Okay, so that's what's going on. That's the overall overview of the English education system here. What's the data that I'm using? I've collected from 2 schools, one a senior high school in February 2020, 4 lessons in a class taught by Kenta. Of course, all the names are pseudonyms. And this was a private high school. It's kind of at the lower end of the prefectural ranking. Then in 2021, I got 3 lessons from a single second-year public junior high school taught by Asuka, again, also a pseudonym. So that's where the data comes from. And as with most Japanese English textbooks, these textbooks consist of compartmentalized thematic units on topics of social interest. So in the high school data, you're looking at a chapter about car sharing and the sharing economy, the so-called sharing economy. And in the junior high school data, we're looking at an introduction to India. Thing is, unlike a lot of the autonomy studies, like I was preparing for this talk, I was looking around and I found Lockham 2019. And in that article, the tensions in autonomy were to do with competing needs of, say, industry versus traditional academia, and how is this resolved or not resolved in the classes. That is nothing like that is happening at all in secondary schools in Japan. Education instruction is still very much within a quote unquote traditional framework, and these tensions of autonomy are still very much within that framework, being mediated by the textbook, by the teacher, and by the school practices. So that's the data. Now, I mentioned earlier what my project was. I was looking at multimodal pedagogy, and I've been using the following frameworks from SFL and LCT. Thanks in part to all the presentations and feedback I've gotten from you all, both here and also the SFLIG symposia. I've got a paper coming out later this year where will be published. So thank you all for your assistance for that. But I'll just give you a brief overview of the systems that I've been working with. First, I've been looking at pedagogy in terms of moves. This is an FSFL where speaker change could occur without transfer being seen as interruption. Exchange, where we look at how moves are organized in relation to each other. Pedagogic register from David Rose's 2018 paper, and that consists of pedagogic activities that are negotiated in pedagogic relations. And then language shift, which describes not just code mixing and code switching, but also translation and paraphrase. And I use that rather than say translanguaging or code switching, because it's explicitly designed to show the structure of how participants, and especially the teachers, switch between languages in very strategic ways. And the vignettes I'll be showing with my data utilize pedagogic register and language shift. And I'll be pointing these things out when I show that data. I'm not going to be talking about multimodality, but just to let you all know that it's there. I'm looking at classroom space in terms of where the teachers and the students are in relation to each other, and also gestures, especially in terms of representing action and also textual action. But again, I'm not talking about that so much today. Semantic gravity. This is what I've been presenting about earlier. I'm not going to review semantic gravity because it's already been talked about. But in the work that I have shown, I was able to show how the one teacher, Kenta, was able to modulate these relatively weak SG minus utterances through his coterminous gestures, or what Duran made in 2020 called determinate physicals, and also the classroom dialogue. But again, I've talked about this in the past, so I'm just letting you know that it's there. And if you want to read more, it'll be in an article soon. The main focus today, though, is about autonomy. So just to remind you all, first principles, what is autonomy? Okay, we're talking about practices that comprise constituents that are related together in particular ways, conceptualized in terms of positional autonomy, where the constituents are related within one context and versus those in others, and relational autonomy, where we're looking at the relations among the constituents of context and the relations among constituents in other contexts. What are our autonomy codes? Again, everyone here knows, but just to remind you, okay, we're looking at internal constituents for internal purposes, where we're looking at sovereign codes, exotic codes, external constituents from external purposes. So I'll tell you about something completely different. Introjective, where we bring those external constituents into our internal purposes, and projected, where we value our internal constituents and orient them towards other contexts. And I actually, with my gestures, I just realized I'm making autonomy pathways. Okay, that's a relational gesture, by the way. As will be seen in my examples, shifts in autonomy codes can be traced in these autonomy pathways, such as one-way trips that begin in one code and conclude in a second code. I've got a few examples of that. Autonomy tours, beginning in one code and moving through the other codes, or returning where they began. And in most of my data, I do have lots of return trips. They move back and forth between codes, and we'll see how that works in a moment. So what are my translation devices? For this, I was inspired by Tan Scott 2020, which for the EAP people, if you're working in autonomy, wonderful paper, and it's really been fruitful for me to work with. For the PA, my target, I thought, would be, well, based upon the fact that MEX guidelines, the target is teaching English in English, that's going to be the target. And the target is teaching in L1 Japanese. Now, it's important to note that when we say negative, that's not saying the teaching in Japanese or the L1 is wrong or bad, or you shouldn't do it, but that's not the target of the lesson. Okay, so it's important to make that distinction. I'll be coming back to that later because I think that has some important axiological considerations for how this kind of research can be positioned. In terms of relational autonomy, I'm simply coding the target as being the content of the lessons and non-target being other contents and purposes like discipline and housekeeping and off-topic content that comes up in the class. And you'll see a bit of that in the data that I've got. Now, I'm going to show one trick, and this is, I'm putting this in the LCT 3.5 because I got the feeling that, when we were reading about this coming up, that people who are seeing this either live or the recording might be new to LCT, and you see all these diagrams, you think, how the heck do I actually create those? One trick that I found that kind of maybe help us busy researchers find trends simply is just to use the Excel chart function. So you'll notice in my PA and RA, I've got what I call designates, and that you simply use that to make a chart in Excel. This works because I'm coding each move individually for autonomy as well as my other SFL systems and LCT codes. When you're coding data, you're coding each move. It's very simple to do. Now, of course, this has to be refined for publication. I'm going to show you the quick and dirty version and the cleaned up version. But for researchers working with the data and trying to figure things out, it's good for seeing instantaneously, boom, this is what I'm working with right now, and this is how I can clean it up and work with it more differently, and maybe some trends I can find. So I'm going to start with autonomy profiles from Kenta's high school class. You're going to look at 2 classes worth of data. One is first is focusing on car sharing services, then reviewing overall sharing services in general, and then looking at bike sharing services. And by the way, the scare quotes around sharing are my scare quotes because this is nothing to do with sharing at all, as we all know. So let's get started. So on the left side, these are this is the quick and dirty version. This is the smoother plot that I wrote by hand. And you can see in the transcript, we've got repeated trips between the sovereign and introjected codes, where the teacher, Kenta, starts asking that what do we decrease by car sharing, repeats the question, going into an introjected code, gets the students into the sort of repeats and clarifies the question in the introjected code, and the students respond in interjected code and then come back at the end in the sovereign. So we see this in a lot of Kenta's data where he starts out in, he bounces between the sovereign and interjected, does lots of two-way trips. It always comes back into the sovereign at the end. Okay. This next sample, and this is a much longer transcript, so I'm going to breaking it down. This is called Corgi for reasons that you'll see. Okay. It starts out with a one-way trip from the projected to sovereign codes as the teacher prepares and focuses his students on the task. So he tells them to stop writing and stop working on, on another project. And then, are you ready? Okay. And then let's start. What are the different kinds of sharing services? So he's doing all of this mainly in the L2. Then we have return trips from the introductory code for language shifted student displays. The students are displaying their answers in L1 Japanese. Projected code for class management. I'm coding that as class management. That was the, calling the students' names for answers. And then exotics codes. Chotomate. Okay, to clarify, but it's mainly staying within, again, the sovereign code. But the end of this segment, where he's going into different kinds, starts talking about pet sharing. He ends up in a rather deep exotic code talking about his mother watching corgi videos on YouTube. As an example, and say, what is it? Do you want to share this wild cat? Okay. So he ends up really deep in the exotic code, trying to reach to his students with examples that they can relate to. And I think a lot of us probably we can relate to that sort of thing where we try to give examples to our students and we end up further deep in Carl's and Howard 2018. There's the Italy, the boot example. This is one of those. Okay, so he starts trying to review the sharing services, kind of ends up in a little bit deeply in the exotic code. Okay, what does he do? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't show that animation. Okay, the next segment, this is immediately after in this class, okay, starts talking about bike sharing services. The reading they had done was about bike sharing services last time. Okay, now for this, he goes straight in from a one-way trip into the introductory code, where the entire most of this segment is spent doing task preparation focus and student displays in L1 Japanese, to review the student's knowledge about the topic. Okay, then we go into more return trips, okay, for language shifted task preparation and displays. And then ending with return trips here, where the students are actually displaying their answers. Okay, what are the benefits of bicycle sharing? What are the benefits? Actually giving their displays in L2 English. So these are examples from one from the high school class. Most of these segments ended within the software code. And this is a common feature in these, what I call EAP light classes, where the focus was supposedly was on the content. The student interaction was primarily in the L1 Japanese, but a lot of the lesson content was provided in L2 English. Asaka, the second year junior high school teacher, her classes were quite different, as shown by this segment. This was at the end of a listening. It's about a young Indian man studying in Japan. And at the end of this listening, she wanted to check whether the students understood what the speaker meant with this particular sentence. And what does he mean by the word all? Okay. So he asks her, all, I'm learning Japanese, all of them are special to me. So, all of them, what is all? All, and she just repeats all and gives examples of all. Now, this is all pretty much introduced, and then even exotic codes where she's trying to give examples of what does all mean, and she focuses and goes back into another exotic code using a rather dated pop culture reference, which again, I think all of us have probably had an experience like that, where you thought you were able to reach your students with something relevant to their lives, and you realize, no, it's 10 years too old. Happens. Okay. These round trips in between the exotic and introduced continue. There was a brief trip to the sovereign code with an example of all. That was basically the only English that was given. Okay. Where the students clarify and task display knowledge. And they actually these are junior high school students, by the way, second year junior high school students. There's about 14, 15 years old. They're actually rejecting each other's answers within the context of the classroom. It was actually relevant knowledge displays, relevant rejecting. And perhaps heading off a one-way trip to the exotic. The teacher affirms when the student displays and repeats the knowledge. Okay, and again, this is all in the introduced code, so it's all in L1 Japanese. Okay, now it's important to note that the students actually displayed this. The student has actually misunderstood. Okay, that means subete. That means every. I thought that would mean everyone. No, it's all. Okay, so the student actually said, "Oh, from this discussion, I actually understood what the listening meant." Okay, and the teacher was able to confirm that in her final affirmation by repeating and praising the knowledge. So, this was actually ended up being a good thing. Okay. Those vignettes that I showed, and I'm pointing this out. I used pedagogic register to make those vignettes. I think it shows potential synergy between the system's pedagogic register and LCT autonomy. For those of you who might be interested, I'd strongly recommend you taking a look at David Rose's 2018 article where he lays this out. I'll be working with this a lot more in my coming work. I'll be honest with you, I'm not certain what these findings mean. This is my first go at presenting some of this stuff. I'm thinking it might be useful for teacher training. Like, how do we teach our students, our student teachers, excuse me, to take their trips judiciously? Okay, and I'm curious if there's been any research about this. I've just finished analyzing this data and preparing it for this presentation, so I haven't had a chance to fully look at the literature. But I'd be curious, what research has been done, if anything. I think again, further work with pedagogic register might be promising to this end. One question that I asked in the last presentation I gave for LCT, and this is where Billy, this is where one of your answers is really helpful. Okay, is still trying to figure out, well, how do we determine what the proper PA might be? Okay, both teachers aligned in principle to the Teach English and English directives of the Ministry of Education in the interviews I did. Even as they, and especially Osaka, aligned in practice to the de facto Jukenego norm. Now, of course, there's also some structural impediments like OECD announced in 2019, and this is still true, that Japanese teachers work the longest among OECD economies. This is especially true of junior high school teachers. Osaka is teaching like 6 classes a day out of 7 class periods, and she was the only teacher that week at her school. And she's also a new teacher. That's the other thing. These are relatively new teachers who is in her 2nd year of teaching. Kento was in his 4th. Okay. How can this, or how should this be factored into determining the target? So I'm a little curious, and before today's talk, I sketched out just a possible draft of an autonomy of a PA translation device that, rather, instead of talking about language, maybe the target should just be the purposes of the lesson. I'm wondering if this might be a better choice. I'm not sure. I didn't show the. I ran it through. I ran it through on Excel, and I'm not quite sure yet if that really accurately describes the data. But I'm wondering if maybe this is a better way of looking at it, and this might be maybe more what I move towards. I mentioned earlier axiological considerations. So we, LCT, people who are conversant with LCT know that PA, we know what it means. We know it doesn't mean that in this case using L1 is negative or bad. Might it misalign, or might it be misaligned by readers from outside of LCT as saying that using the L1 in a foreign language class is wrong when it's not? I mean, there's lots of really good reasons to use the L1 in foreign language classes. And I think the teachers made some very good choices in their teaching. But did they do it in quite the best way? And how is this symptomatic of larger problems and larger issues within English education in Japan, and perhaps more broadly? You wonder. Okay. Regardless, so with greater awareness of concerns within the field of EFL, of English education, for linguistic justice, this greater awareness of potential alignments for LCT research in this area is going to be paramount. And I think we're going to have to think about that. So I'm wondering about it. Looking ahead. And again, I'm sorry, I just blew through those transcripts and didn't give you all much chance to read them. I only gave the vignette, so I apologize for that. I think, though, autonomy appears to be a fruitful means for examining this tension between de jure teaching English in English and de facto Jukenego practices. I think this might be a fruitful way of doing it. I'm going to continue refining the translation devices, analyzing more excerpts. I'll be presenting more this year, so you'll probably see a version 1.0.5 of this in a few months. Ultimate goal for my grant, this is a JSPS Kaken grant based project, and thank you very much. I think I'm the first person doing LCT to get a JSPS grant, so first of many, I hope. The goal is to have a published monograph that brings together all these works across several systems and LCT dimensions. I've got 2 years left, so hopefully you'll see that in not too long. So sorry to just talk at you for a little bit, but that's life. And any questions or comments, or should we just open the floor to the whole discussion about the whole session? Sorry, I don't know.
No, that's great. Thanks, Thomas. I was just watching the way that you mapped it all out and thinking that's really I think it's really useful for anyone who's coming into teaching for the first time or whatever, just to see what kinds of things people do in the classroom and how they sort of move around in terms of whether they're matching the target or not, and move through these different codes. It's really useful. Like it.
So I'm just reading at the chat now. Thank you very much.
There's a lot of non-target stuff going on there.
Yeah. Well, especially there was quite a bit in Asuka's class. Her class was really interesting to watch. Of course, these are all, I observed them in person, and I've, got a lot more data that I haven't shown you. This kind of characteristic of that, I've wondered, because when in the interviews with her, one of the things I found out from, she characterized her students as almost, I'm not sure she used the word delicate, but I think maybe she did. But that kind of they're junior high school students, they needed a little bit more protecting, and she didn't want to push them too much. And that the kind of, I've been wondering if like maybe a specialization code might be a better way of looking at some of her data. Just wondering, is this alignment really in terms of knowledge? What she's just trying to make a safe space for the students to feel comfortable. The thing is, though, when I saw them in the class, I didn't see that. I just saw normal 14, 15-year-old kids, which of course, being 14, 15-year-olds is a very difficult time in life, of course. But I'm not so sure about that. But that's my own judgment, not my personal judgment, not my judgment as a researcher. So I'm not sure about that. And there's lots of non-target stuff there. And that's the question. Is my target wrong? Right?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, definitely not.
That's why I'm asking questions of the data. Like, when we're doing this sort of work with ourselves and we're creating our own research instruments, how do you know if you're actually going at this the right way if you don't have a team of people to work with?
Well, I remember a point that was made at LCT4, and it was basically saying that you can't get to the knowledge if you don't come in through the knowers. So we often talk about knowledge building, and we often, we know that it's relational, we know that it's both, and kind of ideas. And so, yeah, that sort of idea of, sometimes we need to go through the knowers, and maybe that's just what's happening in that particular set of data or instance or classroom. She's working with the knowers to get through to the knowledge.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is we were using non-target communication to build solidarity in community. So, why do we have an issue with that when that happens in the classroom? I mean, so that revolves around the question of what you call the target and what it is really looking at. And I think that shifts even through the course of a lesson, really what the purpose is. And it's hard to get to what the teacher's purpose is, because asking them is unreliable, right? Because they'll tell you what they think you want to hear, not what it really was.
Yeah, maybe it's useful. It's a generic stages. So at one stage of the lesson, the target's here. Another stage of the lesson, the target's there.
Yeah, so that's actually an excellent point, and thank you. How do you get to that target? You basically have to trust your own judgment as the researcher and as the actual person with the access to this data. We're not doing CA here. We're not pretending to be. We're not pretending to be able to get at what's going on in the data.
Or even dual targets. So it makes me think of when you do genre analysis and you look at a text and you try and find out, or you try and think about what is the social purpose, but often there's more than one social purpose. It might be informing and entertaining, or there's usually a main one, which is how we usually categorize things into genres, but there's often more than one purpose going on. There might be one main one, but there's often, a secondary purpose as well. So in thinking about targets for autonomy tours, I think, it's conceivable that there might be more than one purpose going on.
Yes. And that was something I was wondering about, but that didn't, how can I say it? I'm not sure how I could see that in the data. What I saw in the classrooms, and this is where I got into the setting of the target, how much of this is affected by the conditions in which the data was manifested. It mentioned about the teaching conditions of that particular teacher, and the other one as well. These are symptomatic teaching conditions of Japanese secondary school teachers in general, that they are horribly overworked. To some extent, and other research has shown that this use of the examination English, of just translation-based teaching, is often a reaction because it's just simple to manage. Teachers themselves show this. Repeated studies have shown this. This is if you look at, I guarantee you, if you Google Scholar about Japanese English education, secondary schools, this is what you'll see people say. And this is where I get the question of, you've got, what is the most accurate target to use then? Okay, because this is what's actually happening de facto. Even if the government says it should be, in practice, de jure, it should be teaching English, then what really is the best target, right? So that's the question. I'm not quite sure how best to answer that. I'm thinking maybe a good way is to just do both.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
And do both and see the contrast.
Look at what the pathways and the journeys are like when you do both. Because I tried that. It's buried somewhere in my master's thesis, and it was about my target, but the pathways and journeys look very different.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, I just got this data ready right before, but just Sunday, basically. It's when I got all this ready. So I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to do that. That'll be the next presentation. Again, this version 1.05. Okay, but thank you. Was there something else? Sarah DP. Sarah, did you have a question? I saw your question in the chat.
Yeah, I can't do my video at the moment. I think
That's
it was
fine.
kind of I think it was kind of battered around in the chat, and we were talking about, I was interested in teaching to it, if the target of of the lesson is the purpose of the lesson, whatever it is, if it's student oriented or curriculum oriented, wouldn't a successful lesson would end in that particular sovereign code? I was interested in why one of those, well, was it both lessons ended up somewhere else?
Well, no, in Kenta's lessons, he often ended in the sovereign code. And again, this is a high school classes. These are more explicitly EAP-ish. I mean, he explicitly in his interviews, he said that that's what he was going for. Very, very, when I say EAP light, it's very, very much light, nothing compared to what you'd be doing at university level. But, it's content oriented. I mean, that was car sharing, for example. That's he was trying to get at some content, not just the learning of language forms. Asuka at a junior high school level, again, the focus was somewhat on the content knowledge, but the content is very, very, very weak tea. It's was a Indian student in Japan introducing himself. I'm talking about the different languages he speaks, which for 14, 15-year-olds in Japan, where basically their experience of language is as monolingual Japanese speakers who are learning English in schools. That's some content, that's something new. It's something they're not exposed to very much in Japan. But it's not very much. So
it's come up a lot in the conference that when people are talking about autonomy, whether or not there's not really much discussion about what's the ideal place for an effective lesson to end. I was just curious about that. And maybe an effective lesson is something that aligns with the students rather than the target, because you're going to bring them along the next time. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a great point, because and I know Carl has talked about the use of interjected codes for this purpose. And that's why the use of the L1, if you're using my current translation device, the use of the L1 to bring the students into the knowledge, and so they're able to give some display answers in the L2, or at least understand what the teacher is saying in the L2 because that interjected code, that's exactly the kind of thing you want to do. That's why we say, using the L1 is a great thing. Of course,
And it's a
if
specific, and
you
it's
speak
specific.
if you speak your students L1, of course you should use it in a meaningful way, but in a
That's
meaningful way
really
with a goal towards the L2, because that's the point.
because
If you're a
maybe
language
that's
teacher,
the difference of a L2 classroom versus just a normal mainstream L1 classroom. Maybe that's the difference. If tours are going to be a little bit more, a bit more student oriented than target language oriented.
well, you can talk at your students in the target language all you want, but they may not
Yeah.
understand you. And if they don't understand you, you're not doing it, you're not being a very good teacher, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so, there's that. So, and also I was, for this study, I was intentionally observing 2 Japanese teachers of English. This research is kind of based upon elements of my PhD research, where I observed 2 non-Japanese teachers in universities. Okay, so because these are Japanese teachers of English teaching in Japanese secondary schools, there are other assumptions as well that they're going to be aligning with the students, for example, as their homeroom teachers and doing all these other work as their club advisors, for example, which of course is all done in L1 Japanese. But of course. So there's that issue as well that I wanted to get at.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks.
But I like your question about what is the ideal lesson. I think that's I think I reckon a lot of people are it's successful, right? Well, what is your definition of success? You hopefully bring your students along to whatever you hoped to get them to, but that changes over time, right? I think with these teachers, the goal was simply, they want to, in the terms of Kenta, his students, they were in their second year of high school. They had a high stakes test coming up. Their school uses, their school is a feeder school for a university in Western Japan. And so they had to take a version of the TOEIC at the end of their school year. So he had to get his students to pass that. And the thing is that if they don't pass that, then they don't get into the university.
So that's very sovereign, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very sovereign. So you've got a strong sovereign code. The junior high school teacher, she's just trying to get the students in through to the next year. And because of her students, all of her colleagues, she said, were teaching in the same very Jukanego examination English translation-based classrooms. She wanted to fit with what her colleagues were doing, even though she herself knew about CLT work. She had been trained in that. She didn't feel as though, so there's a different sovereign there, and and how we identify this is another question. Yes, this group is, I think we're interjected, Gina.
I'm going to jump in because I think it's just about to step into Daniel's session. But oh my goodness,
are okay. Sorry.
Great discussion. No, it's fine. It's fine.
Thank you. Jen, did she leave? Okay. Well, whatever. Thank you very much for the comments.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for listening to us. And now we're just going to sit here through Daniel's session on building communities.
You're not just going to sit here. You're not just going to sit here at all. No. I'm going to drag you in, kicking and screaming.
In the middle of Thomas's one, I was eating a salad and I was like, yeah, I'm just going to keep eating my salad. And then I was like, maybe not, because I realized we're live streaming on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Well, you know what? Hey.
So I went off camera so that you didn't have to watch me like wiping salad dressing off my face. But yeah.
More
excitement. And apologies for the toast and Vegemite I ate during your talk, Namali.
Extra crunchy. Not on mute.
And we hope the dishwasher is safe. Is clear, Erica.
Fair income. Could have strangled him. I always turn my camera off when I'm eating, I've got to say. It's not a pretty sight.